Okay, Cornell.
All righty, let us begin. Let us begin. We are once again blessed with one of the towering figures in the history of the last 35 years or so when it comes to intellectual engagement. He is, in so many ways, one of the most influential and important public intellectuals. He also happens to be the son of Yoshio Fukuyama, who meant so much to many of us, major moral force in prophetic Protestant Christianity. His father was trained at the University of Chicago. Sociology, was a distinguished professor at Chicago Theological Seminary and played a crucial role in the UCC, United Church of Christ. His grandfather actually was interned during the war. And Francis Fukuyama, who went on to Cornell and excelled in classics, studied under Alan Bloom, then went to Paris, studied under Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, became a bit disillusioned, to put it charitably. Went to Yale for a year in comp lit and decided, no, let me make my way to Harvard. And he studies here in the government department under Samuel Huntington and Harvey Mansfield, writes a dissertation on the role of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. He's, of course, known for his classic work of 1992, The End of History and the Last Man. It was very important to keep track of that title, the Hegelian pole and the Nietzschean pole, End of History and the Last Man. So it's a relation on the one hand to various tendencies, processes in history, but also concerned with ideology, with culture, with structures of feeling and structures of value, what we've called soulcraft in this work. He went on to write on issues of trust, civic virtue. He's written on biotechnology, on the origins of human nature. We can go on and on. Gaps between Latin American and United States levels of inequality and what have you. His recent text is on identity, and that was published, just about a few months ago, right? Just last fall. Identity and human dignity. It's very important to keep those connected together, because we've talked over and over in this class about when you talk about your identity, the fundamental challenge is what is the moral content of your identity? What, in fact, are the ethical consequences of your identity? And so it's a question not simply of labeling, but it's a question of paideia. It's a question of awakening, undergoing self-examination and self-scrutiny in this regard. And so we're going to have our usual format. The first hour, the three of us will have fun going at it. Professor Unger, Brother Roberto, is going to start us off with the
I'll describe.
To make yeah, absolutely. But let's give it up for our dear brother, Professor Fukuyama, Brother Francis Fukuyama. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. So, to make the best use of your time, Frank, our plan is to begin by discussing among the three of us, in sequence, 5 themes that are related to the agenda of the course. And then in the second part of the class, we'll invite your engagement in this conversation. So let's begin, Frank, considering the American debate, the nature and prospects of American democracy from a position outside the United States, placing this American conversation in the worldwide setting. Now, for some time in the latter part of the 20th century and until now, a very powerful idea in the political imagination of the advanced societies, especially the rich North Atlantic democracies, has been that the ideological conflicts and supposed structural alternatives that were central to politics in earlier periods have been superseded, and that there has been cumulative convergence to the same institutional and ideological direction. So on one interpretation of this convergence, the project has been to reconcile American-style economic flexibility and European-style social protection within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements for the economy and for politics. So you could describe the focus of this convergence as a liberal or flexibilized social democracy. Now, a major theme in our discussions throughout the semester has been that this institutional and ideological settlement, which has appeared to be hegemonic and almost triumphal, turns out, in fact, to be an inadequate setting for solving or even addressing the major structural problems of these contemporary societies, including, of course, the United States. And among those problems, there are three that have occupied us, especially during our arguments here. So the first problem is the hierarchical segmentation of the economy, the division of the economy between advanced and backward sectors, which is now takes on a new color in the light of the emergence of what we call the knowledge economy, the new advanced practice of production. And this practice of production, rather than being deepened and widely disseminated, is confined to insular vanguards that exclude the vast majority of businesses and workers. The consequence is economic slowdown on one side and the aggravation of economic inequality on the other. It would be necessary to innovate in the legal and institutional architecture of the market economy to the end of disseminating and deepening this new advanced practice of production. And the inherited settlement seems incapable of providing an opening in that direction. The second theme is the theme of the practical basis of social cohesion. So we've considered the European expression of this problem. The practical basis of social cohesion in those European social democracies has been money transfers organized by the state against the background of a high degree of ethnic and cultural homogeneity. As this homogeneity is eroded by migratory flows, the inadequacy of money as social cement becomes manifest. And it seems that the only adequate basis for social cohesion would be a multiplication of forms of collective action in politics, in the economy, and above all, in independent civil society outside the state and outside the market. And once again, the inherited institutional settlement seems incapable of delivering such an alternative. The third theme is the theme of politics itself, the organization of democratic politics. And one idea that has been recurrent here in our arguments is that all the democracies that exist in the world are, in a sense, weak democracies based on a low level of popular engagement in political life and on a perpetuation of impasse. And they consequently continue to make change depend on crisis in the double form of military conflict or economic ruin. What would be necessary would be a high-energy democracy that would diminish the dependence of transformation on trauma. So all these reflections point us in the direction of a missing structural agenda in the contemporary debates. An agenda that would have to reopen the terms of the social democratic settlement in the United States and in all of these societies. So the basic image of the settlement was the market, meaning the market as it is now organized is a tremendous instrument for economic growth. Unfortunately, it generates inequalities. These inequalities have to be corrected after the fact through retrospective and compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and social entitlements. And it turns out that the retrospective redistribution is never enough and can't occur in the requisite dimension. It would be necessary to reshape the arrangements that define the primary or fundamental distribution of advantage. So that's the context. And in that context, it has seemed inadequate for the American progressives simply to look across the Atlantic to the example of European social democracy, because European social democracy is itself in question and itself unable adequately to deal with these structural challenges. Now, you have thought and written about the idea of this convergence, this supersession of ideological and structural conflict. What do you now think in the light of this experience? What is your take on this situation that I've just summarized and on its application to the American predicament? Cornel, do you want to add something to that?
I think that's pretty direct, though, brother. I think we'll allow our
Yes.
brother to respond,
Yes.
then I'll jump right in.
Yes.
Absolutely. We'll keep the flow going. Jump right in.
So I agree with most of that analysis. I think that, I guess the question I'd have is how you define structural, because I do think that there can be a rebalancing of power within the system, and I'm not sure whether that would qualify as, a really structural change in the sense you're saying. But I do think that there was a consensus that emerged in the 1980s and 90s about the self-correcting nature of markets, about the ineffectiveness of states to actually achieve what they, the kinds of social goals that they were trying to. And that was accompanied by this, liberal project to open up, most of the, the world to competition. And I think we've seen that that's not a good balance, that actually you really, capitalism by itself really does produce these tremendous inequalities, and it's not stable, especially the financial side of capitalism produces immense uncertainty and, periodic crisis and the like. And we Americans, I think, are really crippled in our ability to deal with this because we don't like the state. Essentially, this is one of the most enduring features of American exceptionalism that, another of my great mentors, Seymour Martin Lipset, wrote about this, at great length, that part of American political culture coming out of the revolution and the whole relationship to the British Parliament, at the time of the revolution, was this deep, deep distrust of concentrated state power. There's really no other advanced democracy that has this kind of distrust, and I think it gets to the point where it's a little bit pathological, where we are trapped in a situation where we don't trust the state, therefore we don't give it any authority, we don't give it resources, we don't want to pay our taxes, and sure enough, it doesn't deliver on the things that it's supposed to. And I think, at this stage in the development of capitalism, there has to be, some other kind of powerful counterbalance, because if you think, so I've been thinking about this a lot with regard to my neighborhood, Silicon Valley, at Stanford, where we got these big platforms. If you think about something like Facebook or Google, these are unprecedented concentrations of private power, right? So we used to deal with monopoly in the United States, Standard Oil, and all of the concentrations of wealth that led to the antitrust acts in the progressive era. But these are much larger than that. These are monopolies that extend over hundreds of countries. They're entire societies that do not use email. They only connect with each other on Facebook. And so they've got this unbelievable concentration of political power, and now they're being asked to do things like, moderate the content on your platforms to prevent hate speech, fake news, essentially act like responsible custodians of a public interest, and they are not public entities. They have no public legitimacy. Nobody elected them. They are, profit-making large corporations. And as far as I can see, and so that's one side of it. The other side is, I think part of the problem with the lack of access in the capitalist economy is actually this concentration of power. So it's not just in this, but in the airline industry and pharmaceuticals, in one sector of the economy after another, there's been this tendency towards oligopoly that has closed off competition. There's so much capital in the world. If you see a competitor coming up, you just buy up the way Facebook bought, WhatsApp and Instagram, and then that keeps you safe. As far as I can see, there's only one solution for this, which is you have to have this particular form of collective action called the state. Now, so I agree that the old European approach of taxing and transferring has got, that ran into clear limits in the 70s and 80s, but that state is still useful for certain things, and I actually think that the European Commission is doing God's work, by going after Facebook and Google, among other things, because I don't see who else is going to do this, and I think that that's one of the issues we got to confront, is that we got to get more comfortable with having a kind of political counterbalance to, to that kind of concentrated form of private economic power.
Make sure, did you turn it on?
I think so. Can you not hear me?
Could you all hear, could you hear in the back? It's a little, yeah, I see, actually want to make sure we're hearing. Just make sure that green is on though. Just in case. Just where'd it go? Where'd it go? It's all the way in the back. There you go. Is your green on?
No. Sorry. Okay. Is that better?
Okay. Yes. All right. Now
Sorry
I was
about
thinking,
that.
but you did hear most of it, right? Yeah. All right. All right. Now, just very briefly, one of the distinctive features of our dear brother Francis's intellectual pilgrimage has been his courage to change his mind and to change his mind publicly, in this sense. So that on the one hand, early on, when he surfaces, he's part of a neoconservative movement that is, in fact, highly suspicious of highly concentrated forms in the state. And that's something that all of us have to come to terms with. But with the emerging critique of the war in Iraq, emerging critique of escalating forms of inequality, wealth as well as income, and his emerging critique of some of the consequences of a market-driven culture in which it hollows out so many of the hearts and minds of souls. We talked about this in relation to Tocqueville with the notion of soulcraft, the erosion of civic virtue. So if it's cast as, for example, Hayek over against John Dewey, and John Dewey is saying, if we don't have a healthy conception of the public, of public interest, of public goods, of common goods, including the nation state, but beyond, and we fall solely on what Hayek and the others, the Milton Friedmans and others talking about in terms of somehow markets and morals are going to do the work required for healthy citizenship. And so in a recent interview in the New Statesman, you said some positive words even about certain forms of democratic socialism. Or Karl Marx was right about the escalating levels of inequality and unregulated markets. And so the challenge becomes, how does that translate into certain kinds of policies, given the kinds of concerns that
So Frank's question about what structural means is a good provocation to distinguish two levels of transformative ambition. So one would say we have these concentrations of economic power, to take the example. And then we need a state as the counterpart, as the countervailing power to put limits on that through regulation and through antitrust. And let's call that the minimalist form of structural change, because it doesn't necessarily transcend the inherited institutional and ideological framework. It says within that inherited and institutional framework, there is an underutilized resource, in this case, regulation and antitrust. Let's use it. And for sure. The question is whether that's enough, whether that's just the first step in some larger transformative trajectory. If you take this example of the platform companies, you might say, well, breaking up the platforms through antitrust is not an adequate solution. The social value of the platforms lies in their universality. We need something else. So we need to go further in experimenting in alternative forms of decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities. In other words, experiments in the legal architecture of the property regime. And those in turn are unlikely to happen unless we also experiment with the organization of democratic politics. Then we begin to overcome the limits of the institutional framework. So that's a maximalist understanding of what structural change would mean. And that's a significant distinction in this conversation, because that's where there might be a parting of the ways between the skeptics and those who are looking for, let's call them, strong alternatives.
I'm happy to entertain a discussion about strong alternatives in terms of constitutional organization. I mean, I think that we're actually at a point where that conversation has to happen, because I think some of the inherited constitutional structures we have, impose a straitjacket on some of the possibilities. I actually, as a practical reform measure, I would prefer to go for far-reaching things you can do without having to modify the Constitution, just because that's such a difficult thing to achieve politically in the absence of crisis or some external shock. But for example, there are various ideas like vastly expanding the size of the House of Representatives. Have 2,000 members of the House, which would then reduce district size, by more than an order of magnitude, so that actually representatives would be much closer to, to the people that they represent.
Yes.
Or have multiple, levels of aggregation of representatives like that.
So at that point, what seems to be very important practically and theoretically is whether there is a bridge or a series of bridges from the minimalist to the maximalist, so we can get to there from here. So, for example, with respect to the organization of the market, we could begin modestly with, say, industrial equivalence to agricultural extension to lift up the backward periphery of small and medium-sized firms that don't have access to the instruments of the knowledge economy. And in the political arrangements, we might not begin with the central governmental setup of the sacrosanct Constitution. We might begin, for example, with the re-energizing and reshaping of federalism, but it would then be a wedge into this vivification of American democracy. So once you begin to focus on the direction of strong alternatives, it seems that, and you're looking for the bridge, it seems that it would always be possible to find it.
Yeah, I hope so. I guess I'm just aware of all of the obstacles to doing anything, terribly dramatic. But I do think we're at a moment, and Donald Trump may have contributed to this, where he is so out of the Overton window, that we had been used to, shifting it way over to the right, where a lot of people thought America would never be. And I think that could actually open up the possibility for it shifting, very dramatically in the other direction. I mean, for example, you take something like the Electoral College. There's going to be a real crisis over the Electoral College in the next 15 years, because so we've had 2 of the last 5 presidential elections have gone to the loser of the popular vote, and it's always a Republican that, that benefits. And given the general demographic shifts out of red states and, into urban agglomerations where Democrats do really well, the likelihood is, it could happen every election that you'll get this kind of unrepresentative outcome. And then it seems to me, so right now so I guess Elizabeth Warren has talked about this, a few of the candidates. It now seems like a kind of outrageous proposal. By the way, there are ways of getting to that result without actually having to change the Constitution. But, just to put that on the table was not something that was possible, I think, until, until recently. So, yeah, I think you're right. Maybe something like that could work.
But in terms of this, the American suspicion of using the nation state in a substantive way to intervene either in market or even reshape civic culture. I mean, there's two aspects of it, I think, that we need to highlight, it seems to me. One is that you don't really even have a U.S. nation state until the Civil War. And so that strong nation state is associated with intervening on behalf of black people, vulnerable people, and that deep lock-in individualism that Louis Hartz and others talked about. We've mentioned Louis Hartz in this class, his classic of 1955, The Liberal Tradition in America. The obsession with the space for individual flourishing, individual rights and liberties over against a repressive nation state. And that's a contribution, especially when they're kings and queens and so forth. But how then do you disaggregate calling for a strong nation state when among fellow citizens it's associated with helping these black people, helping these poor people, as if they're not helping the corporate elites in terms of the corporate welfare. And the other aspect of this is the militarism, because it seems as if most of our fellow citizens really don't have a problem with a strong nation state when it's tied to military buildup. But they have deep problems when it comes to strong use of the nation state on behalf of the most vulnerable. And then it gets quickly racialized, given the legacy of white supremacy. What do you make about those two aspects of the difficulty?
Well, that's obviously a big problem. So when you have racial hierarchy on top of class hierarchy, it makes any kind of strong state action to protect the vulnerable hard because, race and class, you don't have working class solidarity. You've never had it in the United States the way you have it in most European countries, because a lot of the white working class is quite happy not to be part of the black working class, and therefore there's been this big divide. Same thing is true in South Africa, where you've had similar, and that was the story in the South, before the Civil War. This question of why do all these working class or farmers in the South who don't have slaves, they're not living on plantations, why are they fighting and dying, for the slave owners? And I think it was really that racial hierarchy that, that was the thing that motivated. So there's no question that that's a big obstacle. But, you do have these other periods of really remarkable social change. Actually, the period of the progressive era was quite similar in many ways to the current one, in that from the end of the Civil War up until the 1898 election, there was a constant the two parties, the Republicans and Democrats, were more or less equal. They kept trading power back and forth. Then all of a sudden in 1898, the country is actually in a similar situation as now, because it was trying to decide, are we still this kind of rural, agrarian, Thomas Jefferson, decentralized society, or are we actually going to be a modern nation, capitalist, dependent on a global capitalist economy? And I think that was the fight, and the country couldn't make up its mind which one it wanted to be. And then all of a sudden there's an election, Republicans win both branches of Congress and the presidency with McKinley, and then Roosevelt after McKinley's assassination. And all these things that didn't seem possible in the previous 30 years become possible. So it does seem to me that there is some precedent for breaking through. If you read the story about either the creation of the Federal Reserve or, more importantly, the income tax, that's a remarkable story. We have one of the most progressive income taxes of any rich country.
90-some% for the well-to-do.
Yeah. And at the time, it was completely revolutionary. I mean, to this day, most European countries do not tax income, nearly as progressively as we do, and that's all a residue from this earlier period. So I don't know that that means it'll happen, but it does seem to me that there's some historical precedence for, this kind of more dramatic change happening.
Now, that then leads us to the second theme of populism, because in the absence of an effective response to these unaddressed structural problems, we have populism. And we have populism now all over the rich world. And how are we to interpret it? So it seems that in one sense, it is a kind of liquefaction. It is agitation outside the structures, against the structures, through personalist leadership. That's one thing it means. And another thing it means is the pretense of delivering solutions that turn out not to be real, precisely because they're not structural.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, it's a continuation of the problem to a second stage rather than a resolution. And it would therefore be a great opportunity if there were alternatives, which for the most part there are not in the present organization of things. How are you seeing this phenomenon of populism?
Yeah, so glad you asked. So the conventional wisdom on populism is that it is a reaction to globalization and the kinds of inequalities that have been created by this entire liberal project over the last 50 years. And there's no question, I think, that as a trigger, that's the case. You look at the statistics on, 50% of Americans saw no increase in their real incomes between 2000 and 2016. I mean, that's really pretty remarkable stagnation for a lot of people. But the curious fact is that if inequality were the whole story, you should see a huge increase in left-wing populism, right? You should see. I mean, we should have had democratic, electing democratic socialists, since the 2008 crisis. And instead, what we've seen is the Tea Party and then all of these right-wing movements in Europe. And I think the reason for that is this factor that I talked about, which has to do with identity, that there's a cultural element where the right has been able to interpret economic decline in a more effective way than the left has. And this really has to do with this question. I mean, so there's this Greek word thumos that I use, which really has to do with one's inner sense of worth or pride and the need to have that recognized, which is a non-economic motivation for wanting to get into politics. And I think that the right-wing populists have managed to capitalize on the fact that a lot of those economically, and it's not the poorest of the poor, it's really people that thought they were middle class or upper working class that are now either stagnating or falling. And there's also a gender component to this, because a lot of times it's the wife or the girlfriend in the household that's bringing home the paycheck. And so there's this blow to one's self-esteem. And I think these opportunistic populist politicians have succeeded in translating those in cultural terms, saying that what's happening to you is really the result of immigrants and foreigners and especially elites who do not have your best interest in mind. And the thing is that there's enough truth to that, it's a powerful message, because in fact, I think the elites have not been paying a whole lot of attention to that old working class. So that's why I think that they've been able to capture it at this moment.
Would you argue, though, let's say since 2004, that we're living in a Yeatsian moment? The center cannot hold. The neoliberal project cannot deliver precisely because they've been unable to speak to the interests of those who wrestling with wage stagnation and high underemployment and unemployment and so forth.
That's right.
But here, this is where the irony comes, because you see, the Obama moment was a moment in which left populism could actually have taken hold, but with the racial symbolic figure who reproduces the neoliberal center with a progressive face. But there's no there in
Yeah.
terms of following through for poor people, following through for working people.
But we have to be careful about the vocabulary because
What
we're going
vocabulary?
we're going back and forth between two meanings of populism, right? The old American concept of populism was a populist is someone who defends the interests of the people. It was uncomplicated.
Absolutely.
And now the American elites have imported the fancy European meaning of populism, which is populism is this extra institutional action in which you are a demagogue promising things you can't deliver because they don't have structural content. So,
No, but I'm talking about the American.
Yeah, I understood that,
right.
but we started out with the European and we ended with the
yeah.
American.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
no, absolutely. But I was talking about the US
but my
No, but I
question
want
is
him
this.
to answer that question in
Yeah.
terms of that Obama moment. A missed opportunity, same is true with Hillary Clinton, right after. A missed opportunity because the center is not holding to raise these issues of inequality, to raise these issues
Yes.
of connections to Wall Street. And here, race actually becomes a barrier because it's all about neoliberal black symbolic presence rather than substantive poor and working class policies. Now, would you agree with that?
You know,
Was that a little harsh, you think?
I am not sure that you could have done that at
that moment.
that soon after the crisis. And in fact, it seems to me what may happen is Donald Trump is going to bring about this shift to the left because he has personified, you know, this really ugly form of right-wing populism to such an extent that everybody now is just racing as far as they can in the opposite direction. Whereas you didn't have that kind of personification of the
moment of Wall Street criminality, Wall Street greed, out of control, you would think that would have been a moment for intervention as opposed to pro-Wall Street policies,
Well, so-
homeowners left dangling.
Well, so then you got to argue that the only reason it didn't happen was not a kind of lack of a social base. It was just leaders that didn't realize that they had this big opportunity in their hands and weren't good at
I call
organizing
it
it.
cowardliness,
But,
actually.
but let's go back to this question of populism. And so here's something that we have to understand. What is the economic program of right-wing populism? So to a significant extent, it overlaps, surprisingly, with the economic program of institutionally conservative social democracy. Buy a few more years for declining mass production through restraints on migration, through subsidies, through protectionism. But conventional mass production industry has no future. So that's a losing operation. This is the fragility of the economic program of right-wing populism. So then there'd have to be a different point of departure. So one point of departure is we have to convert mass production into something else for it to have a future. That's this disseminated form of the knowledge economy. The occupational structure is being hollowed out in the middle. That's what's provoking this anxiety. But it has certain points of resilience, that in this occupational structure, there are groups that they've been called the new artisans. They have technologically equipped problem solving combined with personal interaction, like nurse practitioners or the more advanced trades. Now, then a large part of the economy could become like that, but it wouldn't become like that spontaneously. It would only become like that as the result of a project. So there are all these points of departure in the concrete situation for a productivist project. But where is the productivist project? That would be the answer to populism.
Yeah, it would. That would be a much better answer. So I was actually, when you talked about Soulcraft, are you familiar with Matthew Crawford's book, Shopcraft as Soulcraft?
No, I've got to
So-
take a look at that. I like the title.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. So Matthew Crawford got a PhD in political theory at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. And then he goes to work for a think tank, which he thought was about science policy. And it turned out it was actually being funded by the oil industry to bat down global warming. And he figured this out, 6 months into his job, and so he got really discouraged, and he moved back to his native Richmond. He is a really good motorcyclist and mechanic, and so he started a motorcycle repair business in Richmond. And it's a beautiful book because he describes, taking a motorcycle engine apart, down to the last screw and then reassembling it, and then how there are all of these very tacit kinds of knowledge that you need to have about how you avoid over-tightening the bolts, and you got to get the spark timing right, and all of this stuff that he had learned and really didn't make use of. And he says, so the basic point of the book is that as part of this globalization effort, they don't teach shop anymore in high schools. Everybody is a graphics designer or learning in computer boot camp, because everybody's got the idea that the only worthwhile work is this high-tech, kind of thing. And he actually raises, I think, what you were trying to get at, that, maybe there is, if you had a different concept of labor and what worthwhile labor was and how to compensate certain kinds of worthwhile forms of labor, maybe you could move to a different form of production that value. And by the way, I think that there are other countries that actually do this more successfully. So Japan and Germany, this is what actually made me write my book, Trust, because it really struck me that within this broad capitalist world, there are really interesting variants that reflect cultural attitudes. So I remember reading that the British SAS during the war had captured an entire German radar set, and they brought it back across the channel to England, and they took it apart, and they could not believe how beautifully machined the thing had been. And they said, British machinists could never create, an object this precise, and so forth. And it made me think, that's very interesting. And so I looked into it more. There really is this, it's industrial, but it is a kind of prizing of a certain kind of industrial skill. So in the United States, machinists have no status whatsoever. In Japan, they have this special honor they call living treasures. I think there are like 100 of them, and so some of them are poets, some of them do tea ceremony, some of them are machinists, that work for Toyota that can, machine a part very beautifully. And it does seem to me that there's some kind of room for worrying a little bit less about, absolute efficiency and prizing a different,
But there's something very basic, which is the progressives cannot triumph if all they have is a progressive approach to the demand side of the economy. They need to have a progressive approach to the supply side, and they haven't had one.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm calling a productivist project. Now, that brings us to the United States, American history, our third theme. So we've been discussing throughout the semester the obstacles and the opportunities that American history offers for this attempt to develop structural alternatives. So we've discussed the reform movements in American history, the defense of the small against the big, the acceptance of the big and its regulation by the strong state. And the idea has been the insufficiency of both, because they don't question the established form of the market. We discussed at some length the experience of the New Deal, which it now fascinates the progressives, but doesn't offer a model for what would be needed now, because it had an early moment of institutional experimentalism, focused on the corporatist restabilization of the economy, rather than on the democratization of economic opportunities and capabilities. And then it narrowed its funnel to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity. Yeah. We now need something more than that. We need this opening up, this enhancement of effective agency, and not simply the provision of a protective shield. But then we also discussed episodes in American history that help to suggest a direction. So, for example, we discussed the example of the early 19th century, in which there was on top a Hamiltonian project of mobilization of national resources, and on the bottom, selective democratization of the then crucial sectors of agriculture and finance, weakened in subsequent periods of American history by the limitations of thought, naturalization of the private order, and the limitations of politics, weak democracy. And we discussed the fascinating episode of the war economy, in which large-scale mobilization of national resources was combined with radical institutional innovation, quarantined as if it were not relevant to the experiences of the peacetime economy. And that led me to suggest in our polemics the project of a war economy without a war. Now, we wanted to hear you on how you view, looking back at American history, as American history as a source of inspiration and of constraint in this effort to reinvent the progressive project.
Yeah. So I have a really specific comment about that project. So I'm all in favor of, basically what you propose. I like the idea that you have a strong state that can counterbalance the market and can shake things loose and so forth. I do think that you cannot repeat that wartime effort today because of the accumulated dreck of the regulatory state that would make, so, this is something appropriate to say in a law school, there are too many legal constraints to actually acting in a decisive way and being experimental, and for the government to take risks that sometimes, will lead to, someone getting injured or somebody, losing their property or something of that sort. And it seems to me that unless you accompany that by a
Innovation in the forms of administrative action,
Yeah.
in the form of the rule of law.
Yeah, but you've got to clear away a lot of that
Yes.
that stuff in order for that to happen. Like, okay, so I've actually been focusing a lot on infrastructure because, I deal mostly with poor countries and, they really need infrastructure. But we actually need infrastructure here in the United States.
Absolutely.
In my state of California, all 40 million of us have standing to sue any given infrastructure project under an environmental law, CEQA, that was passed back in 1970. We do not have to say who we are or who we represent. It does not have to be over an environmental reason. As a result, every project that starts, is litigated in the courts by NIMBY neighbors, by, business. So I think the idea of having a flexible, experimental, risk-taking government is a great idea. But I think that we have a legal structure that is so bent on guaranteeing us against risk, using this.
And the state has to be able to experiment.
The state has to be able to experiment, and experimentation means you make mistakes.
Yes.
Sometimes people are hurt, sometimes things go wrong, and you cannot,
And one of the things experiment must mean is that the state shouldn't be required to do things in an all or nothing fashion.
Yeah.
That it should be able to try something out in a limited context before it universalizes the solution. That has to be part of the meaning of experimentalism.
Yeah.
But what do you do, though, with the fact that there's a sense in which our economy is a kind of war economy? If that 56 cents for every dollar is going to the military industrial complex, 5 wars fought simultaneously, right? The degree to which, our military budget is bigger than the next 8 countries combined, 43% of all military production is a U.S. affair, that's a war economy. It's the war profiteers who are constitutive of the economy with no public discussion about it, which means that already you've got structural constraints of the experimentalism that we're talking about, because there's not a whole lot of experimentalism in terms of relation of the nation state to the military component of the budget. Is that a
Yeah.
fair characterization?
It's a little bit unfair. I mean,
Yeah, tell me how it's unfair.
it's whatever, 20% of the discretionary budget. It's certainly not 20% of the whole budget, because you've got Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, which, are like 80% of federal spending. So actually, as a percentage of total federal spending, it's actually much smaller.
It's much
The
smaller
other
than
thing
that.
is that
But
there's,
it's disproportionate, you would argue,
well, maybe.
relative to the uses
Yeah,
of that military.
yeah. Well, I mean, we've certainly been misusing it in the last 20 years.
Right,
There's no
right,
question
right.
about that. However, I'm not sure that if you radically downsize the military, it wouldn't solve any of these
No,
other problems.
no.
It wouldn't make us more experimental. I mean, it would provide resources.
You would
but-
have resources, immense
Yeah,
resources.
but resources right now are not enough. I think,
No, that's
to
a
get to-
necessary but not sufficient condition.
I think that to get to this, this point that Roberto is talking about, it really takes a different mentality towards government. So right now, if the government makes a single mistake doing anything, it's going to get slammed, by the opposition party, by the media. The reason that federal procurement is so expensive is that in the past, there was some accounting scandal in a federal procurement problem, and then you create this thing called the FAR, the Federal Acquisitions Regulations, which is now several thousand pages long, and you add a few more hundred pages to it to prevent that from happening. And so I just think that unless you loosen up the system, all this stuff is like grit in the machine that's slowing the thing down. So you got to somehow,
And how do you do that?
well, you got to have a government that actually updates laws, and gets rid of ones that are not relevant anymore.
It's a set of fundamental innovations in the form of administrative action in the rule of law, which are the counterpart, which is the public law counterpart to this productivist project. In other words, what we have by way of public administration in the world is what you could call administrative Fordism. It's the public law counterpart to industrial
right.
mass
Yeah,
production.
that's right.
So the economy has gone ahead, but the state has not. And that's an imbalance that has to be corrected.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, I know we've got 2 more points and we'll open it up.
yes,
here.
yes. One of the areas in which we diverge, the two of us,
The two of us.
yes, is nationalism. Nationalism. So the national idea, it's related to populism. It's related to the politics of identity. So what is the interpretation of the distinctive element in contemporary nationalism and the consequences? So in this debate, I took the position that the tangible collective identities in the world, national identities, are being eviscerated because the nations are imitating one another. They're sacrificing part of themselves to succeed, practically. And as actual difference wanes, the desire for difference is aroused. And because the less tangible it is, the more dangerous, because not subject to compromise. Only the object of an intransigent faith, the impotent rage of the will to difference. There are then 2 responses. One response is the response of liberal cosmopolitanism, suppress the will to difference. The other response is the response of radical democracy, equip the will to difference. That's what I want. That is, difference is not the problem, it's the solution. Real difference to be created in the future by this radicalized form of the market economy and its counterpart, a high-energy democracy. Cornell stepped back with the suspicion of the dangers of nationalism. And so intervene in this debate on my side.
No, on the side of Veritas, on the side of Veritas.
Yeah.
The truth,
Okay.
as you understand it.
I'll take both Veritas and I'll side with Roberto. I just got back from spending 2 weeks in Europe trying to plug my last book. And I think, in a way, Europe has this problem more deeply than the United States does. So there is a common view that says that you cannot talk about national identity without it devolving into a kind of crude, aggressive, exclusive nationalism of the sort that we saw in the first half of the 20th century. So in Europe, nobody on the left wants to talk about national identity. or anything with the word nation in it, conjures up, this nightmare of chauvinism and so forth. And I think that that is fundamentally wrong, because I do not think you can have a state, and I don't think you can have a democracy if you don't have a sense of national identity. And what that national identity means is a common set of narratives about where we come from, where are we going, what are the basic principles, of our legitimate political system. So it starts with what the Germans call Verfassungspatriotismus, which is constitutional patriotism. But it has to have an emotional content beyond that. And so the word I use to describe what I think is the right form of national identity is a creedal or a civic identity that is connected to democratic values, right? So what binds you together is not race, it's not ethnicity, it is not religion, it is basically a set of ideas that are critical to the working of your democracy. And if you don't have that, you don't have the trust that's necessary to actually have democratic, deliberation. And so that's what I think is missing. It's been very much weakened, I think, by these economic forces, and it's now being threatened by the populists who want to redefine the nation in these old ethnic terms. I mean, all of these anti-immigrant groups in Europe and the white nationalists here are seeking to do that. They want to drag national identity
back to the tribal idea, as
It can
opposed
go
to being
it can
a
go
form
either
of
way.
moral specialization within humanity.
But it can go either way. I mean, nationalism, like any ideology, is not just ambiguous, but it's promiscuous. It will lie with a whole host of different forces in place. It was in the name of nationalism your precious grandfather was put in an internment camp, right? But in the name of nationalism tied to a universalism, what you call democratic values, you're rooted in the particular form of nationalism, but you're always looking for the universal dimension to it. I mean, to me, this is what your beloved father was about in terms of every flag under the cross. But that cross was universal. It's humanity. It's global. And the internationalism, especially living in an empire, is very important, because the nationalism is so easily captured by the white supremacists, the white nationalists, a whole host of xenophobes. So it's not as if one is against nationalism, but without that stress of the universalism, what you call democratic values, then you're going to end up with the Steve Bannons of the
But
world.
I don't.
Yeah, that's his name.
I don't think that you can actually base that kind of identity on a true kind of global universalism.
No, it could be grounded in a national project.
It has to be grounded.
But it's got to be tied to a universal vision.
Well, no, the values can be universal, but so this is the problem, right? So that power in the world is based on nation states, for better or worse today.
Yes.
Right? Nation states are incredibly powerful and they're dangerous, and we develop institutions like the rule of law, like democratic accountability to constrain that power. And so we've got this very important balance between, concentrating power in a state and then constraining it. And the unit of constraint is the nation state. It's not the United Nations, it's not the European Union, it's really basically all these
And it's not the subnational spaces either.
It's not the subnational. I mean, you can delegate some powers to those spaces.
But the main scene of action
main
remains
scene of
the
action.
nation state.
And as long as that's the case, you have to have something that binds people, citizens together in loyalty to that particular nation, and they can have relatives and they can have friends in other countries, but essentially, I think they've got to have some kind of emotional connection to this political unit that is controlling the power that's deployed by the state. And so that's why I think that you can't be too universalistic. And I guess the further thing is not a rational commitment.
No, this is a non-rational, transrational affair.
Yeah, it's a very emotional commitment. You don't want it to be emotionally irrational to the point that it becomes, chauvinistic and so forth. But, you have to have the right feelings of patriotism, basically, towards this democratic unit that you are a part of. And so
Strong national projects have as one of their elements expression in a distinctive institutional path. So the globalist ideology is associated with the idea of institutional convergence. It's where we started the conversation. The alternatives are disappearing. We're all marching to the same direction. That's the house of globalism. And That's
No, I don't
what
think that's
humanity
true.
is
No,
rejecting.
I don't think that's
No.
true. You're downplaying the role of social movements that are universalist, that are international,
Yes.
that are tied to solidarity across national boundaries.
Yes.
These are very important movements.
They are, but they're not the main scene of action in the
Not
world
yet,
as it
not
exists.
yet. It depends on what the historical moment is. In the 1860s, all of a sudden in the Civil War, everybody wants to know, where's the British Empire going to come down? Where's the French Empire
Yes.
going to come down in terms of who wins the war?
Yes.
1960s, the same is true in terms of decolonization.
The nation state will not be eternally the main scene of action. It is now. And so it's just a fact about the situation that if you want convergence, you're against the nation.
And we're going to have to open it up.
Yes,
'cause
but,
we'll go all
but why
afternoon.
don't we
We'll go
open
all
it up
afternoon.
with this last theme of the politics of identity? So tell us first, Frank, why are you a critic of identity politics?
So first of all, you have to understand my definition of identity, which is
Yes.
extremely broad. When you use the word identity politics in an American context, you think about race, gender, ethnicity, gender preference. That's part of what I'm talking about, but I think that identity is much more fundamental. It's much more deeply rooted in a very long philosophical tradition that I actually trace back to Martin Luther and Rousseau and any number of thinkers that lived quite a while ago. And it really does have to do with this idea that we have this inner worth, this inner self. It may be based on a group identity, it could be individual, but that society is fundamentally against us because it is what's keeping us from realizing that identity, whether it's being a Catalan, whether it's being an artist, whether it's being an African American that is not allowed to feel proud of himself, this sort of thing. And so that means that there's a lot of identity politics in that sense is universal. The first really big one was actually European nationalism in the 19th century. And I think the real problem and the reason it's dangerous is that form of ethno-nationalism is now what's powering these populist movements, in Hungary and Turkey and Poland, in Britain, in the United States with Donald Trump. And that's what's dangerous because it's connected to this charismatic form of personalistic politics that says, I am the only one that understands you and I'm the only one that Donald Trump, he said this is what he said when he accepted the Republican nomination. I alone understand your problems and I alone can fix them. And when you get that kind of emotional defense of an identity connected to that style of politics, it is an attack on all of the liberal institutions that are part of a liberal democracy, right? Rule of law, checks and balances, and that's what's been under stress in our country and in Hungary and Turkey and all of these places.
So just to focus, if I understand you correctly, you're saying in a country which is already has the complicated relation between race and class that the United States has, identity politics then runs the risk of fragmenting and inhibiting a transracial progressive majority of working class people, siloed in these little identities. And on the other hand, it then generates, as the right-wing counterpart to itself, white nationalism. But its fundamental error, the point with which you started, is a spiritual error, that it sees a human being as a placeholder in some system of social and cultural divisions, and our nature is to transcend these places in which history has provided for us.
Yeah, I would maybe make a little bit gentler a version of that.
Yes, that's not my nature to be gentle.
That was profoundly Hungarian rather than Fukuyama.
It does seem to me. So, for example, the problem of police violence, against African Americans in inner cities, that's a real problem, and it is one that affects blacks more than whites. And I just don't think you can deal with that, without thinking in these identity terms. And you have to deal with that. You need to lower those levels. Or with sexual assault, sexual harassment, of course, you need to deal with these issues. I just think that in a democracy, you need to complement those kinds of initiatives with something that's more integrative, that reminds people that you are actually part of a.
The problem is when the demand for respect and recognition turns into the organizing criterion of social and political mobilization, and that produces this calamity.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I've been wrestling with this, as I've been talking about this issue, that I think fundamentally these identity movements are rooted in real wrongs and social justice.
Oh, sure.
But at a certain point, they can go wrong, and I think they go wrong when you essentialize these fixed categories like race, gender, so forth. And that happens, I mean, it happens more in certain parts of the society, like in universities and in the arts and, places like that than it does, in the broader society. But, there is a problem there.
Let's open
Let's
it.
open it up. Saw a hand way in the back. I don't see the hand anymore. Ready? Go jump in.
Professor Fujiano, along the way, you identified at least two obstacles to dramatic state action. Early on, you characterized this pathology of American exceptionalism in terms of a kind of mistrust toward the states, and Professor West gave us linked that mistrust to the Civil War and the state's intervention on behalf of marginalized populations, the most vulnerable, at the perceived expense of elites. A little later on, you talked about kind of grit in the system, the complexity and esotericism of our kind of regulations and laws that hamper state action. And those strike me as different but related, possibly, obstacles. And maybe a way of understanding them is to think about left and right mistrust of the state. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between those two obstacles and their source or origin.
Well, I think you can have lots of different sources of mistrust of the state. So the support for racial minorities and women, is one of them. But a lot of it is states just make big mistakes, right? So what did the Vietnam War, the Iraq War do to our confidence in the ability of, the state to manage foreign affairs and national security properly, right? It was pretty bad, and it had nothing to do with race or gender. So I think that there's lots of different sources of this. I think one thing, to think about this a little more concretely, if you look at that wartime mobilization, well, actually, start with the New Deal and go through the wartime mobilization. You created all of these new institutions like the Atomic Energy Commission, the TVA, so forth. And it was really amazing. I mean, some of them didn't work so well, but you built an atom bomb in, 3 years, and you won the war. You ramped up, production, all this stuff. I don't think you could do that in the United States today, even if you had a similar, political moment where you really wanted to have the state operating that powerfully, because back then it was the first time we'd ever done it. Nobody had ever created these institutions before. You could delegate, a lot of, authority to, like David Lilienthal, the first head of the Atomic Energy Commission, that, and actually he was both in the TVA and in the AEC. Today, you just can't imagine that happening because I think of this accumulated, legacy of constraints on state action. So I do think that the distrust of the state is actually well-founded because, we've gotten to the point where you start a new, you try to imagine Medicare for all. I mean, if you think that that's a goal, do you think that the U.S. government can actually implement this thing effectively and efficiently in a way that's going to satisfy people the way they're satisfied, in Europe with their universal, like with the National Health Service? I think it's going to be pretty hard. And so unless you fix the public sector and make it run better, which I'm all in favor of doing, I don't think you're going to be able to get there.
Another question.
So I've been thinking about the kind of national identity piece as inherent to a country's ability to kind of function. Maybe for years now, I've studied from by heart, but
Well, that's one of the problems of the present moment is that I think that there was at least an elite consensus on that, and that is beginning to fray in really serious ways. But yeah, I do think there was a national identity. So what's the national identity? It's basically the stories that a society tells about itself, right? And they can come from the bottom up, or they can come from the top down. And I think actually to establish a national identity, you got to do both. And that's changed in the United States, but it's changed in positive ways. So before the Civil War, being an American meant being a white male, basically, right? And so you fight a civil war that kills 600,000 people, and as a result of that, you pass the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments that then, you know, create birthright citizenship. I know that there are some people that you know, want to try to undo that at the moment, but you know, it's a kind of foundational moment in terms of American identity, because citizenship rules actually are the single legal instrument, juridical instrument that are the most related to what your identity is. Who are you allowing to become a citizen and therefore participate in your politics? But then it turns out that you have Jim Crow and segregation, and so that is not a reality for, you know, a large part of the country and for one entire race. So it takes another 100 years, and it's a very shameful fact that it took that long. But then by the time you get to the civil rights era, you do get, I think, to this point where you can, you know, I mean, if you go to a naturalization ceremony, if you haven't been to one, I would really recommend going to one. They're very moving. They're very different from what happens in Europe, where it's much harder to get naturalized. But, you know, Americans make a big deal of it. And I think that what indicates to me that there is something to this creedal sense of citizenship is that, you know, you get all these people from all these different countries, from Korea, from Guatemala, from, you know, Mexico and so forth. They take the oath, you know, of naturalization. Sometimes the governor is there, there's a military band, you know, it's people make a big deal of it, and then they can get up and say, I'm an American, right? Now, nobody's going to laugh at them, you know, for saying that after they've been naturalized, after they've gone through that. In Europe, you cannot do that, right? So if you are a Turk, a Muslim Turk who grew up in Germany, you only speak German, you don't speak a word of Turkish, you cannot get up and say, I'm a German, right? Because German has a very definite ethnic connotation. And so that's what I think it means. I do think we do have a meaningful, you know, sense of Americanness that is tied to a creed rather than to an ethnicity. It is being threatened right now, and I think we got to do everything we can to hold on to that because it's really important.
Yes,
And by the way, just one more, since you brought up this autobiographical stuff, you know,
about your life?
yeah, my whole family,
Yes,
they were
yes,
all
yes,
interned, you know, for
yes,
being
yes,
Japanese
yes,
during the
yes,
war. But I think all of my relatives that went through that were still, in the end of that process, still proud to be Americans. And in the end, you know, I remember my father saying that, you know, after the internment, there was an apology, and he didn't really think that there was any moment at which, you know, his being, you know, racially different was really a big obstacle to, you know, his doing what he wanted. So I think he bought into that, you know, that story as well, even though he recognized that there's plenty of social injustice, you know, in America. So.
Question.
Mr. Fukuyama, thank you for your time.
Raise your voice, we can hear you.
Mr. Fukuyama,
There
thank
you
you
go.
for your time and joining us here today. At the outset of the lecture, you had mentioned that there is an unprecedented concentration of private power in large corporations, and at the end of the conversation, Professor Unger had mentioned that the preeminent scale of power in the world today is still the nation state. It's the frame and valence by which we measure power. But I wondered if you could shine a light on if we are maybe misunderstanding or maybe not ascertaining how there seems to be this rather interesting layering of sovereignty within and without of nation-state borders. And I mean this in very virtual senses of the word, both in terms of the private sphere and the power that corporations like Facebook and Google and digital platforms exert on the public space, but also in very real terms in terms of like extra-state territories and these kind of special economic zones, which are very much so manipulative of the idea of statehood in the 21st century. And I wonder if you
Yeah.
could try to
So there's no question that technology has given, it's given states a run for their money. because it's very hard for them to keep up with all of these factors, multinational corporations, offshore, finance havens, all this stuff. But I really do think that it's not that you couldn't get this under control. I don't think we want to. I mean, I think this is one of the problems with the internalization of a lot of the liberal thought, kind of free market thought, that you didn't need to do this. There are still, rich Americans today that don't particularly object to tax havens because they say, well, taxes are unjust anyhow, and I don't want to have to pay them. And so, the tax haven is just giving me a chance to actually pay the government what it really deserves. And so as long as that kind of thinking still persists among the elites, you're not going to do anything to crack down on them. And as long as you somehow think it was just completely off the table to consider taking on, Google, you're not going to do it. But that I really do think is just a wrong conception of the possibilities for using state power. And by the way, I do think that on the antitrust front, you actually could use the state very productively to get to that more decentralized economy, because you don't want the government to be directing
Of course.
all this stuff. You
course.
just want to clear the way for them to be able to do this, and you can't do this unless you have a sufficient amount of political power to.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's not just a negative operation. It's a positive operation of creating new rules under which people can have decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities, including fragmentary or temporary or conditional property rights.
Do you agree with the what Sister Elizabeth Warren is putting forward in terms of trying to somehow decentralize these huge oligopolies and monopolies?
I really love this. I mean, I'm really glad that somebody put this on the table finally. It's been remarkable because 18 months ago you couldn't have done this.
That's true.
But I think we're at this moment where you can get proposals like this,
In public conversation,
yeah, and
public discussion.
she doesn't really know how to do it.
But nobody does.
Nobody does.
That's
But
true.
you got to start somewhere. You
That's
got to
right.
have this
That's right.
discussion about how you would do it. So that's hopefully actually at my institute, at Stanford, that's what we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about, is how you actually operationalize something like that.
That's powerful. Dear brother in the middle here.
Justice Fukuyama, the Fragile Liberal Coalition that sort of amalgamated Fox, most of the New Deal, seems split now. You have these technocrats that identify with meritocracy, personal responsibility, not so much with lower income housing in their communities.
Yeah.
You got a working class segment that no longer believes that poor are poor because of an economic system being challenged. You got right-wing ideology. It's very crystalline, effective ideology that's convincing the man on the street. It's not globalization, it's not technology, it's immigrants, things like that that are causing some of these issues. How do we fight these ideologies? And also the zero-sum game seems to be, affirmative action produces a job for a minority that's a job taken from a white. I mean, this perception of zero-sum game within what used to be a decent coalition. I mean, is this something that can come back together again, or is this never going to happen?
Well, I sure hope it's going to happen. I still think that there's a lot of room for leadership, in politics. And recently we've had a bunch of kind of brilliant but evil leaders that were able to mobilize people for the wrong purposes and do that extremely effectively. But I still think that you can mobilize people, under banners that are more integrative. So yeah, I think that's what politics is all about. It's this hard slog of actually communicating with people, having a vision. So you got to start with the vision, right? So if it's going to be structural, you got to say what that is and what it's actually going to look like and why it's realistic, and then you got to explain it to people. I think that many people underestimate the intelligence of democratic publics. Now, given the election of this president, I think there's a lot of cynicism about that, but I think that, the question is whether you can keep fooling the American people over and over again. Abraham Lincoln didn't think you could. But that requires a process of argument in which you bat back some of these bad arguments, and you just got to make that argument, these counter arguments over and over again. And you got to mobilize people that, believe in the things that you believe in. It's just kind of hard work of politics.
Who are some of these brilliant but evil leaders you have in mind? Do you want to enumerate, or do you want to hold off on that?
Viktor Orban,
Oh, you mean
Yaroslav
around the world?
Kaczynski,
I thought you were talking about American history in the last 25
Donald
years.
Trump. Donald Trump.
He fits.
know,
He does fit. Yeah.
Chris Kobach. Once you get into the American list, you can go on for quite a while.
Interesting. Yes, go ahead.
Regarding national identities, I'm very intrigued how you mentioned that people must have emotional, quote unquote, non-rational connections to the state. And I'm reminded of how so many national identities are myths. And historians said in order for a nation to be created, there needs to be lies. And I'm curious if this inherent characteristic of national identity, so much based on myths and lies, is it too fraught to be used for good? So I'm of Christian faith, and there's one of my favorite verses in the Bible said, "Our citizenship belongs to the heavens because we're not found on earth." And I hold that dear to my heart because I don't see these myths and lies essentially defining who I can be allegiance to. I feel connected to a lot of different people because I believe that national identities aren't everything. So that's kind of my very existential question, and I wonder how.
Well, but the thing is that identities are not either or, and you don't have to actually choose one identity. So if you say, I believe that I'm, an American, or I'm, some other, a citizen of some other country, it doesn't mean that you give up being a Christian or, being a great, soccer player, or, all of the other things that you can use to fill out your identity. In terms of the lies, so yeah, there's always something in national identity that is, I wouldn't call them lies in the sense that someone is deliberately trying to say something that they know to be untrue, but they are socially constructed, right? They're stories that people tell, usually of a positive sort, that, shade the truth. And then, as Ernest Renan, this great theorist of nationalism, said, there's also a lot of historical amnesia, and so there's this tendency to kind of forget the bad stuff in your history. So if you go to Ulaanbaatar, there's this great monument, statue of Genghis Khan, who's now, seen as the father of modern Mongolia, despite the fact that he raped and pillaged, across most of Asia. So, yeah, all of that is the case. But I think that's where the democratic test, is important, right? You can't lie about something where you violated an important democratic norm. And so any narrative about the United States, for example, that tried to eliminate the history of slavery or segregation or any of that, I think is not acceptable, and that should not be part of the narrative. So you've got to be honest, with these fundamental kinds of issues, but you can also tell, a progressive story, which I think is what, Americans have got to do. The other thing is there's a lot of things that you add to a national identity that are, in a sense, politically more neutral. So there's a couple of examples that I give which are actually about sports, right? And the film Invictus, if you've ever seen it, was about Nelson Mandela in the 1996 Rugby World Cup, which South Africa hosted, right? So Morgan Freeman was playing Nelson Mandela, and the whites played rugby and the blacks played soccer, and he wanted his fellow black South Africans to actually root for the national rugby team, and it was all about the conflict with the ANC about getting them to, to do this. But he realized that sport is one of those things that actually unites people. There's another nice example here in the United States where the sport of baseball, was deliberately introduced. If you've ever watched Ken Burns' film about baseball, it was deliberately introduced in part to overcome the, the anger and the hatreds that had grown out of the Civil War. Basically to give people in the North and South something else to think about other than their grievances, that came out of that war. So national identity, consists of a lot of things like that, and that's what it gives it, the kind of cultural thickness that makes it a real identity and not just a kind of abstract, idea.
We were talking over lunch about your love of French literature, Flaubert and Stendhal and Balzac. Who, in your view, are the great American prophets that speak directly to this issue of actually try to keep track of the democratic values that are not reduced to narrow nationalist formulation?
My favorite American storyteller is actually Frank Capra.
Interesting. Filmmaker, huh?
Yeah, I mean, he's a real myth maker, because if you watch, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or It's a Wonderful Life, watching it now, in retrospect, you see in terms of race and gender, it's not completely, you would not make a movie like that, but I think that in a way it does represent a certain kind of ideal about, small town America, like he hates, the big banker who's
He's
got
in
this.
solidarity with the vulnerable.
Yeah, he's in solidarity with the vulnerable, that
Absolutely.
he's just trying to, he gave up this life of travel. Jimmy Stewart gave up this life of travel that he, dreamed about as a boy in order to give small loans to all the little homeowners in Elmira, New York, this sort of thing.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's a very nice, story about American democracy. And
Fascinating. Question here and then in the back. No, we'll hear and then we'll move right to you, Brother James.
So I really appreciate you talking a little bit about your personal history and your grandfather's experiences
Louder,
in
please.
this country. I think I'm curious about how there might be limits to what a national identity looks like, and that might be one of those examples where there's a moment in time in which there are constraints around what constitutes being a patriot, what constitutes being a citizen, and as you mentioned, those constraints are being tightened by some folks right now. So I'm wondering if you see limits to constructing a national identity and potential traps for doing so, and what you might do to avoid those traps of kind of decentralizing people and also like excluding folks. And the second thing that I'm wondering is, oftentimes identities are constructed against some sort of other. So, and that's nearly always been the case since the founding of the country. Indigenous people are the other, Black people are the other. In this country, like people who are non-white, often seen as the other still, perpetually the other. So I'm wondering what you do about that problem of needing to have an other to define yourself.
so I think, it's pretty straightforward. You cannot base national identity on any fixed characteristic that is not accessible by certain parts of your population, right? And that excludes then race, ethnicity, and religion. I think no modern democracy can build national identity on any of those three things. So then the question is, you need a set of ideas that really form the core of a creedal identity. And like I said, I think they have to be ideas that are related to liberal democracy, right? So it's rule of law, fundamental equality of all citizens, constitutional order, and then things that, proceed from those kinds of foundations. I think that's, so then, so the complicated discussion is what do you add to it to give it that kind of thickening that we were, discussing earlier, so that people really have more of an emotional attachment. So sport is, one thing. I mean, if you think about what makes for European national identity, like how's a German different from an Italian? Well, a lot of it is food, right? They eat different kinds of food, or they got different traditions, or they read. So actually, this is an interesting point, that a lot of traditions are actually built around literature.
National
You know,
literature.
national literature.
Absolutely.
So if you look at the French national identity, part of it is civic in the sense that it comes out of liberty, equality, fraternity, the ideals of the French Revolution. So French citizenship has always been much more open to kind of sort of multiracial society than, let's say, German or Dutch or Scandinavian. But it also has to do with French language and reading, the classics of French literature. And, so I always thought that one of the greatest things, little facts about France, was that Léopold Senghor, the Senegalese poet, and actually the first president of Senegal, was admitted to the Académie Française back in the 1980s, right? So a black man, but because he could write the French language beautifully, that was the only qualification that mattered for, his admission into that kind of, it's a real pantheon in France, of people that they admire. And so, I think none of those kinds of things mean picking an enemy or being aggressive or.
But Frank, just to press on a possible source of disagreement that may motivate some of these questions, take your example of Germany. So there's an old German identity, tribal, based on blood, which is more than suspect, given German history. But the other thing, the alternative to it, which was the Verfassungspatriotismus, the constitutional patriot, is not for real. That's a fabrication. That's bloodless. So and that seems to me to be the problem with this idea of locating the national cohesion simply in a set of abstractions of beliefs. There's an alternative, which is neither one thing nor the other, which is collective action, doing things together, and doing things together across the boundaries of these small identities, which are the object of the identity politics. So that involves then the reconstruction of social life, economically, politically, and in civil society, so that it is open to these new forms of collective action that create new difference. And then people will be united dynamically, if they are at all, in a project or in a series of common projects. That seems to me to be immensely more promising than just the convergence around a set of abstractions, which to me seems like a phony kind of cohesion.
Yeah, well, it could be if you just leave it at that. But yeah, I actually am all in favor of national service, right? I think that America would benefit greatly if people had this more, instead of thinking about their rights all the time and entitlements, that they actually thought about themselves as owing duties to public interest. And if you managed it properly, it could have exactly this impact. I mean, that's really what the military does. It brings together people of different races, regions, and social classes. Like one of the segregations that I think is the most striking to me, living in Palo Alto, California, and visiting Cambridge, Massachusetts, is that you don't see working class people except when your toilet breaks or something, and you have to call somebody to fix something. And so if you had national service, it could be doing all sorts of things, teaching or, working on infrastructure or doing, lots of different useful things in the country. And it would actually bring people, very diverse people together to do something difficult in common. So I think it would have, very much that effect that you're talking about.
Do you support bringing the draft back even for the upper middle class?
Well, I think actually a draft would be good in and of itself just for foreign policy reasons, because if all of the elites,
obviously,
had to send their children.
You said obviously?
Obviously, that's why they abolished that's why they abolished conscription, in order to be able to undertake these imperial adventures. So we have an army of poor people fighting wars for rich people. That was the reason why it was done. And so what's shocking is that this was acceptable in the United States and that was supported by the American progressives. A clearly subversive and anti-Republican initiative.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we brought some marks of fire out of our brother, didn't we? Wow. That's all right with me. What about the sisters? We want some gender. Oh no, Brother James, I promised you. Any others women sisters, please don't hesitate. If not, we'll just keep going.
Thank you. I'm sure implicit in what you said about the South African national team, but for people who may not know, the Springboks were a segregated national team under apartheid.
Yeah.
And as part of the boycott of South Africa, that included a sports boycott, I joined people that went out to Albany, New York, where they were playing under apartheid, and the National Guard were called out to protect that game. So there is a background to that story, but not to take away from it. I think that when you talk about people not wanting to be fooled, or you can't fool all the people, I think there are a lot of people who are not fooled anymore, who see themselves as not being fooled anymore by what they would see as phony Democratic Party elites who don't really speak to the needs of working class American people, although that can be interrogated. In looking for an alternative to that is not Donald Trump, people are grappling with which way to go and what program makes sense. Is it what Elizabeth Warren is talking about? Is that just trying to bring people back in to the phony non-solution, or is it more Bernie Sanders, or is it something else? I think the biggest single obstacle in pragmatic terms to a successful policy, that would do that, has to do with the issue of immigration. And I think that's precisely why Trump keeps hammering on it. And so I would like to hear a little, what would be a successful, practical program for that alternative?
Oh, that is a really easy question to answer. Yeah, I mean, so look, we've had the same possibility in front of us ever since the 1980s. You cannot move forward on the immigration problem without doing two things. First, in order to get the right on board with a comprehensive reform, you have to actually have a plan for enforcing existing immigration laws. You can have high levels, you can have low levels, we can debate that, but there's a basic principle that I think is a normative principle that a country ought to be able to, a democracy should be able to control its own borders. That shouldn't be something that we're arguing about. We can argue about levels, as I said, but not about the principle. So you need a policy to enforce. I actually think it has to be based on employer sanctions because ultimately, half of all undocumented people are in the country as visa overstayers. They haven't crossed the Mexican border, right? So you need a system like that. So that's to get the conservatives on board. And then to get the left on board, you have to give these 11 million existing undocumented people that don't have criminal records, you've got to give them a path towards legalization, right? And so this was what IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, tried to do. The problem there was that because we don't have a national ID system, the employer sanctions didn't work. And furthermore, the employers themselves didn't want to be the enforcement agents for it. But essentially, there were a couple of Senate bills that were introduced under George W. Bush. One of them, co-sponsored by McCain and by Ted Kennedy, and it, it would have toughened. It would have done a lot of things that there's a lot of popular support for. So it would have shifted the grounds for legal immigration towards skills rather than family unification. It would have imposed, pretty tough employer sanctions, and it gave, basically everybody that was undocumented a path eventually towards first getting a green card and then, full citizenship. That is such an obvious, that's the only way we can move forward on this, right? And I think the reason that we have not been able to do this is that on both sides, right now it's, the tougher deal is on the right. There are people that are just absolutely opposed to one or the other sides of that trade-off. And somehow you've got to solve that. But yeah, I think there is there's a pretty clear solution at hand. It would have been great if we had passed whatever it was, S 1369 back in 2006.
Question, yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Fukuyama. I've read in recent years, you've been sort of more critical about the neoconservative agenda on foreign policy. And sort of in light of that, our military spending doesn't necessarily constrain our ability to be like more experimental in our government. One, like, what is your vision of like the most effective foreign policy moving forward that can be more humanitarian? And do you think that there's a way we could use the military and its resources to engage in these experiments? I kind of think like Eisenhower and like military resources being a reason to build up our interstate highway system.
Well, I tried to define, what I thought was, so I'm basically an internationalist. I think the United States actually does have a responsibility to stay engaged in, the world in general, and I think that we ought to continue supporting our existing democratic allies around the world. So I think NATO is a good thing, and I think, Japan and South Korea deserve, continuing support. And there's a lot of challenges to all of those, places right now. And that does require spending some money on, on our military establishment. So, so we can argue about exactly what, the appropriate level is. But I think that you're not going to get really dramatic. I don't see how you can continue to support those alliance commitments and then have a dramatically lower defense budget, all right? Now, the spin-off issue is a really interesting one. Actually, it works in both directions, because sometimes the military is actually more likely to adopt civilian technologies than the reverse. And in fact, some of those are kind of controversial, like when, drones start acquiring, AI technology and, this sort of thing. And but that's kind of a separate, that's a separate issue. But yeah, I think that if you want to actually have a common project and you want to stimulate the economy, military spending is actually one way to, one way to do it.
Question and then here, right after.
Thank you for being here. I'm interested, you mentioned some innovations to our political system, such as increasing the House of Representatives or abolishing the Electoral College. I'm having a hard time envisioning in practice how that would actually, what are the conditions essentially that would have to exist? I mean, we haven't passed a constitutional amendment in 30 years, and even when we did it, it was, I think, some material about congressional pay or something like that. I can't envision, because of my whole sort of adulthood has been in an era where I haven't seen that kind of dramatic change. It's hard to see that happening without one side of the political spectrum sort of saying that it's the gain or the benefit of another one. So how would that actually happen today?
Well, you're the one that's going to have to tell me how the structural stuff happens. My imagination...
The great majority of it doesn't require in its initial stages constitutional changes. So, the basic answer to these questions about transformation is there's a direction. And you begin small, and then there's accumulation of steps. So the problem is the legacy of the history of thought makes us think that radical change is totalistic change, and gradual or fragmentary change is just some kind of reformist management. But that's not true. That's just false. And we have to jumble the cards and associate the method of fragmentary change with radical intentions. That's how it really happens in the world. That's the only way it happens. And specifically, specifically with respect to the constitutional arrangements, most institutional changes, a large part of institutional changes are infralegal. They can happen with very little change of the law. Then there's a second stage that's legal. Then there's a third stage that's constitutional and ideological. It's not as if it were like a all or nothing. That's just not how structural change is.
The force, I think, if this brother's question is, where's the visionary leadership going to come from? What social forces will be behind it? What constituencies do you appeal to? That's what's also missing.
Of course, and a project, a powerful transformative project, is the reverse side of a set of alliances, which it builds. That is, every powerful transformative project develops its own base, and that's what Roosevelt did in the New Deal, and that's the nature of transformation. So there has to be there's a potential majority of productivist and worker interests in the United States. And the danger of identity politics, it's one of the several forces inhibiting the development of that progressive majority. Another force is another mistake of the progressives is to poison the situation with the introduction of the contest of moral agendas, because then they divide the people in two contesting religious and moral projects. That then allowed the conservatives to exercise power in the United States for decades, combining material concessions to the interests of the moneyed classes with the moral accommodation to the moral concerns of the moneyless classes. That's what they did, but they could only have done that because the progressives failed to develop a project that would have been a sequel to Roosevelt's project. And that's the whole history of these last decades. So that's the context of our discussion, right?
Yeah. If I could make a plug for my own favorite institutional reform, I actually think that if we adopted either ranked choice voting or two-round system in American elections, we would be doing a lot better because I think the current plurality system in a situation where the two parties are fairly evenly balanced really feeds polarization. And if you have ranked choice voting or a two-round system, it's much easier to run third parties, and you'll have much more choice, and you also will get much more cooperation between parties because, you know, they have to make coalitions. So, and that's something you can do without constitutional change. That's
Absolutely.
just
So take another example. Most of the Republican governors in the United States are trying to run their own industrial policies. And they begin with a primitive idea. They say, I'd like to have my own Silicon Valley. So it's a primitive conception of what it would mean to disseminate the knowledge. But it's better than nothing. It's a beginning. So that's where you start. Now, if you combine the idea of disseminating the advanced practice of production with the energizing and reshaping of American federalism, which also has wide appeal in the United States, it's a beginning. And that's a beginning that begins to cross the barriers of right and left.
No, but Brother Roberto, I mean, if we were going to wait for the next female or male Roosevelt, the Roosevelt who told his own power elites, I'm committing class suicide, I'm with these working people, I'm with these poor people. One of the reasons why these governors won't do that is because they're tied to entrenched corporate interests.
I understand.
There's a context for them. There's constraints for them. There's no high-quality visionary leaders who are willing to go off that cliff.
Yeah.
Lincoln did too. Now, let's wait for the next female Roosevelt to see, but
they
my
need-
God,
but
we
they-
got to hold our breath
But
so
they
long.
also need to have ideas.
They've got to have vision, you got to have ideas, but you got to have courage, you got to have willingness to cut against the grain.
Everyone is hostage to the ideas that are available to them. And so Roosevelt was a radical experimentalist, but the actual content of his institutional experimentalism at the beginning of the New Deal was very limited, because the ideas that were available in the early 1930s were these ideas of corporatist restabilization.
No, but he had the CIO. He had tremendous pressure from below in the face of 51% of our fellow citizens living in poverty.
Yes.
And he had multiracial tremendous
Yes,
pressure,
yes.
but he still opted for Jim Crow because the Southern elites in his own party wouldn't allow the bills to go through, even though his wife, courageous that she was, Eleanor, said, you better hit Jim Crow head on. He'd say, I like to in private, but I can't do it in public because people in my own party will not allow it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of leadership you're calling for. That's part
Yeah.
of Soulcraft too. Would you agree?
yeah.
So this is what
That's true.
this is what always happens.
Shake your hand,
This is what always happens in our discussions. He disagrees with me, but I don't disagree with him.
We got 2 more classes to go. We're gonna really keep him accountable here. Absolutely. Well, it is about 3 o'clock. Yeah, all right. Let's give it up for our dear brother Francis. Give it up for him. That was wonderful, man.
Thank you.
Definitely. Indeed, indeed. Yes. Oh, but let me just say goodbye to my brother before we before we go. We get a chance to talk.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right, hey.
Bless you.
Yeah, take care.
Bless you.
Great to talk to you. Yeah.
You.
Thank you.
You stay strong. God bless
Okay,
your
all right.
family.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good. Thank you.